They said the blood ran thicker in these valleys, that family was everything, that the bonds of kinship were sacred. But in one forgotten hollow of America, those words were not a blessing. They were a curse. When cousins shared the same wife, when brothers exchanged sisters as if they were currency, something began to rot inside the family tree. Children were born not out of love, but out of necessity, out of secrecy, out of a pact to keep the bloodline pure, though nothing about it was pure. This is not a story whispered in church halls or recorded in family Bibles. It is one buried deep in silence, hidden under generations of shame. Yet if you look closely, if you dare peel back the veil, you will find it. You will see the truth carved into hollow cheeks, into eyes that never aligned, into the warped faces of descendants who never asked to carry their ancestors' sins. The family we are about to unearth is among the most inbred still alive today. Their lives are not tales of romance or love, but of confinement, tradition, and the slow suffocation of choice. When bloodlines collapse inward, they do not vanish immediately. They linger, deform, mutate, leaving behind a living testimony of what happens when a community locks itself away from the rest of the world. You can picture them now, tucked away in the Appalachian backwoods, far from the highways, where dirt roads split into gravel trails and finally disappear into thick woods. No neighbors for miles, no outsiders allowed. A place where the rules of the outside world mean nothing, where family secrets are guarded like buried treasure, and where the word kin means far more than it should. The cousins who shared a wife, the brothers who shared a sister, the children who grew up never knowing where one branch of the family ended and another began. These are not myths or rumors, not tall tales meant to scare the curious away. These are real people, breathing, surviving, and bearing the marks of choices made long before they were born. And tonight, you will hear their story. When you trace their lineage, you don't find a tree, you find a knot. Names repeat like echoes down a long corridor, brothers marrying sisters, cousins marrying cousins, a cycle too tight to ever escape. Outsiders would have called it madness, but to them, it was survival. In the isolation of the mountains, where poverty stretched on for generations and strangers were few, family was the only currency. And when family is the only choice, lines blur until they vanish completely. It began quietly, almost innocently. A cousin taking in another cousin, a brother promising his sister to kin so she wouldn't starve. But what began as survival hardened into tradition, and tradition calcified into law. And when laws are written in blood, they cannot be erased without pain. By the time anyone noticed, it was already too late. The branches were tangled beyond repair. The wife who belonged not to one man, but to two. Her life shared between cousins. Her body caught in a pact neither love nor freedom could undo. She bore children, some carrying the heavy silence of deformity, others seemingly untouched. But all of them tied to a past they could never escape. Each child carried the weight of whispered rumors, of stares from rare outsiders who wandered too close, of a community that protected its own with teeth bared. The sister who was passed between brothers, not because she wished it, but because her family said it must be so. Imagine living a life where the word choice had no meaning, where love was not something you search for, but something already decided, parceled out among blood, where your world ended at the tree line, and beyond it was a world you were told was dangerous, sinful, foreign. Generations grew up like this. Children who didn't know if the man they called uncle was also their father, if the woman they called cousin was also their half-sister. Iden. Tighties blurred until family became a circle with no edges, no beginnings, and no end, and all the while their faces carried the truth outsiders were too afraid to say out loud. This is how a bloodline folds in on itself, not in one moment, not in one scandal, but slowly, over decades, until a family becomes a mirror that reflects only itself. And when no new blood comes in, the shadows grow darker, the whispers heavier, and the secrets almost too heavy to hold. The children born into this family carried more than just their parents' names. They carried the burden of biology, the twisted inheritance of generations that had collapsed inward. Some were marked from the beginning, crossed eyes that never quite focused, foreheads that jutted unnaturally forward, jaws that could not close, limbs bent at wrong angles. Others seemed untouched at birth, but carried hidden weaknesses, lungs that failed too soon, hearts that strained under the weight of their own bodies, minds clouded in ways no prayer or schooling could clear. Doctors rarely came here. Outsiders were not welcome, and the family did not trust them. Illnesses lingered untreated, deformities were hidden away, and explanations were given in hushed voices. God made them this way. But beneath those words lay a silence too heavy to speak. They knew why. They had always known. The cruelty of inbreeding is not just in the body, it is in the mind. Imagine a child growing up knowing the world sees them as different, as broken. Imagine never leaving the valley because the outside world points and whispers, because the very shape of your face betrays you. Some withdrew into silence, unable to speak more than a few words. Others lashed out in sudden violence, confusion boiling over into anger. The family learned to live with it. They said, "That's just how he is," or "She was born slow." But those were just phrases to cover what they already understood. The sins of the fathers had not disappeared. They had taken root. And yet, there were survivors. Some children grew strong, carried themselves with the stubborn resilience of the mountains, but even they could not escape the shadow. Every smile, every glance in the mirror, every family gathering reminded them of the truth they carried in their blood. To marry outside was forbidden, to leave was betrayal, and so the circle remained unbroken. A child born here had no say in their fate. They inherited a name, a bloodline, and a destiny they could not choose, and for some, the weight of that inheritance was heavier than life itself. In the quiet valleys of Appalachia, you could still hear their cries. Some carried on the wind, others buried beneath the soil. This was not just a family, it was a cage built of blood. If you walked into their world, you would feel it before you saw it. The silence, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, watchful silence of people who know they should not be seen. Strangers were rare, and when they came, the family closed in. Children pulled back into cabins, eyes peered from behind curtains. Men stood still in the yard with crossed arms, daring anyone to ask questions. Outsiders never stayed long. Most left with a chill that clung to their bones, as if they had wandered into a place the modern world had forgotten, or perhaps chosen to forget. This was a family both proud and ashamed. Proud enough to defend their way of life, ashamed enough to never speak of it outside their hollow. Their existence was a secret kept alive through silence, through rituals of survival. Food came from hunting, from scraps of land that bore enough to feed them, but never enough to free them. Schools, if they existed at all, were small, with children repeating the same last names over and over, generations stacked on top of each other. And within those cabins, bonds were made and remade in ways outsiders could not fathom. A cousin did not just share blood. He shared a household, a wife, sometimes even a bed. Brothers and sisters grew up together not as companions, but as future spouses chosen before they understood what the word meant. The community told them it was natural, that outsiders were dangerous, that the family was all they needed. But isolation has a way of turning love into obligation. A girl might look at the man chosen for her and feel nothing but dread, yet there was no choice. A boy might know that the woman beside him was both his sister and his wife, yet he was told it was right. Over time, resistance faded. They stopped questioning, they accepted, because in their world there was no escape, only the endless repetition of the same names, the same foe, the same sins. For the rare outsider who did stay long enough to see them up close, the effect was unforgettable. Features distorted by generations of shared blood, eyes that didn't quite meet yours, smiles that revealed too much or too little, and always That silence, not just from the family, but inside yourself, as if you had witnessed something you were not supposed to see. A family not lost to history, but hidden in plain sight, breathing, watching, continuing. What is most haunting about this story is not just the faces or the deformities, it is the way the cycle persisted, long after the first mistake was made. The cousins who shared a wife knew what they were doing. The brothers who shared a sister understood the weight of it. Yet no one stopped, because to stop meant to admit it was wrong, and to admit it was wrong meant to collapse the fragile world they had built. So the silence stretched on. And over time, silence became protection. Neighbors who lived a few ridges away may have heard the whispers, but they did not interfere. Perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of fear. In rural America, people learned not to question what went on in another man's home. If the children looked strange, if the family kept to themselves, it was easier to turn away than to confront. And so the bloodline folded further inward, generation after generation, untouched by the world beyond the mountains. Some researchers who dared to trace the family history found records that read like riddles, the same surnames looping back on themselves, children born to women with no listed fathers, marriages recorded between kin. It was less a family tree than a closed circle, a symbol of confinement written in ink and flesh. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. This was not accident or coincidence. This was deliberate, carried on as if it were law. And yet, even within this cage, there were flickers of humanity. A boy who wanted to leave, to see the world beyond the ridges. A girl who dreamed of a life where she could choose whom to love. They were the ones who carried the heaviest burden because they could see the walls around them. They could imagine freedom, but the price was unbearable. To leave meant betrayal. To break the circle meant destroying the only world their family had ever known. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have broken free, or would you have stayed, bound by blood, by duty, by silence? It is easy to judge from a distance, but to live it is to walk in shadows that never lift. By the time the modern world began to notice them, the damage was already visible. Photographs surfaced, black and white images that seemed to belong more to nightmare than to memory. Faces with sunken cheeks, jaws that jutted forward unnaturally, eyes that looked in different directions, children standing barefoot in the dirt, clothing worn thin, their expressions blank, as if even their emotions had been stolen by the weight of their inheritance. Outsiders who saw them often described a chill, as though they were looking at people from another time, people who had been left behind. But these were not relics. They were alive, moving, breathing, surviving, and in many ways, thriving in their own hidden way. Because survival does not always mean beauty or health. It means endurance. And this family endured. Through poverty, through shame, through the judgment of outsiders, they continued on, each generation bearing the scars of the last, each child stepping into a cycle already written before they were born. Some tried to document them. Journalists, historians, photographers, they came and went, but none stayed long. They captured pieces of the truth, fragments of the story, but never the whole, because the whole was too dark, too heavy, too unsettling to put into words, and so the family remained half known, half remembered, a rumor on the edge of American folklore. The truth, however, is that they are not folklore at all. They are not myths whispered around campfires. They are flesh and blood, walking through the same years as us, only hidden away from the eyes of those who could not bear to look. Their existence forces us to ask questions most of us would rather not face. How much of who we are is shaped by blood? How much of our fate is decided before we take our first breath? And what does it mean when love, choice, and freedom are stripped away, leaving only a duty to family, no matter the cost? The cousins who shared a wife, the brothers who shared a sister, they were not just men of their time. They were architects of a cage that still holds their descendants today, a cage made of tradition, silence, and blood so thick it could no longer breathe. And so we arrive at the darkest truth of all. This family is not gone. They walk among us still, tucked deep within the ridges and hollows of Appalachia, carrying faces that tell stories without words. Their lives stretch like shadows into the present, reminders of choices made generations ago that cannot be undone. They are a living monument to what happens when a bloodline is folded against itself again and again until it becomes something else entirely. There is tragedy in their survival, but also something hauntingly powerful. Against all odds, they endure. Outsiders call them grotesque, strange, even monstrous. But monsters are born of myth. These people are real. And reality is far more terrifying than any story we could invent. Their faces do not lie. They carry the history of every cousin who took a cousin, every brother who took a sister, every child born from a pact that should never have been made. And yet, in their silence, there is also defiance. They have outlived judgment. They have outlasted the curious who came with cameras and notebooks. They remain unchanged in their isolation, untouched by the world that once sought to expose them. Perhaps, in their own way, they have won. Because while we speak of them in hushed tones, while we struggle to confront the weight of their truth, they continue to live, to breathe, to pass down the only world they have ever known. But if you look closer, you will feel it, that chill of recognition. Because their story is not just about one family, it is about us, about the secrets we bury, the lies we tell ourselves, the cages we build and lock from the inside. This family is the mirror we do not want to look into, because it shows us what happens when silence rules, when tradition becomes prison, when blood becomes destiny. In the end, this is not just the story of the most inbred line alive. It is the story, of human fragility, of the darkness that grows when light is shut out. And perhaps the most haunting part of all is that somewhere out there, hidden in the woods, another family just like this may be waiting, keeping their silence, holding on to their secrets. And if you ever wander too far into those hills, you might find them watching,